"You don't belong here," she hissed, hurling my vintage leather suitcase into the marble hallway with a force that echoed through the opulent corridors of the Grand View Palace Hotel. Her perfectly contoured face twisted with disdain as she stood in the doorway of what she claimed was her penthouse suite, designer heels clicking against imported Italian tile. I watched my belongings scatter across the floor, silk scarves and carefully folded blouses spilling from the open case like wounded birds. I didn't flinch. Instead, I reached into my handbag, a simple black leather piece that had belonged to my grandmother, and pulled out my phone with the kind of calm that comes from knowing exactly who you are, even when others don't. My fingers moved deliberately across the screen, finding a contact that read simply, "Marcus, GM." The call connected on the first ring. "Miss Chen," came the familiar voice, warm with genuine respect. "How can I assist you today?" "I'm having a slight issue with accommodations on the 42nd floor," I said quietly, my voice carrying just enough weight to convey the situation without drama. "Perhaps you could send security up to clarify some confusion about room assignments." There was a pause, the kind that speaks volumes. "I'll be right up personally, Miss Chen. 2 minutes." As I ended the call, the woman, all bleached hair and artificial enhancements, laughed with the kind of cruelty that wealthy people often mistake for sophistication. "Calling your boyfriend to help you? How pathetic. Security will just tell you the same thing I'm telling you now. This floor is for important people only." I smiled then, the same patient smile I'd perfected over years of being underestimated. We'll see about that. What this woman didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have imagined as she stood there in her designer athleisure wear worth more than most people's monthly rent, was that my family had built this empire from nothing. 3 generations of sacrifice, vision, and unwavering determination had created the luxury she was so desperately trying to claim as her own. The story really began 63 years ago, when my grandfather, Wei Chen, arrived in San Francisco with $17 in his pocket and a dream that seemed impossible to everyone except him. He'd left everything behind in Taiwan: his family's small farm, his position as a village teacher, and the woman he'd planned to marry, all for the chance to build something lasting in America. Those first years were brutal. Wei worked 3 jobs: dishwasher at a Chinatown restaurant from 5 a.m. to 2 p.m., janitor at an office building downtown from 3 p.m. to 11 p.m., and weekend shifts at a laundromat that catered to the growing population of immigrants who, like him, were chasing the American dream, one load of laundry at a time. He lived in a single room above the restaurant, sharing the space with 2 other men who spoke no English and trusted no one. The walls were thin, the heat inconsistent, and the smell of grease and detergent seemed permanently embedded in his clothes. But Wei had vision. Every morning, he would walk past the grand hotels of Union Square, studying their facades, their doormen, their effortless elegance. He would notice which guests returned, which services they valued, and most importantly, what was missing from their experience. "Americans understand luxury," he would tell my grandmother years later, "but they don't understand hospitality. They think expensive means good, but they don't know the difference between service and servitude." The journey from those early observations to the empire we own today was paved with countless small victories and devastating setbacks. Wei's first winter in San Francisco nearly broke him. The restaurant where he worked as a dishwasher was struggling, cutting hours and wages. The office building had hired a new cleaning company that employed only workers who spoke fluent English. The laundromat was barely staying afloat, unable to compete with newer, more modern facilities opening throughout the city. For 3 weeks in January 1962, Wei survived on a single meal a day, usually rice and whatever vegetables he could afford from the day-old produce bins in Chinatown. His roommates had found other work or moved on, leaving him alone in the tiny room with its single window that looked out onto a brick wall. The isolation was almost harder to bear than the hunger. It would have been easy to give up, to accept defeat and return to Taiwan with his tail between his legs. Many immigrants of that era did exactly that, worn down by the relentless challenges of starting over in a country that seemed determined to keep them on the margins. But Wei had made a promise to himself, and more importantly, to the memory of his father, who had died fighting the Japanese occupation of Taiwan. "Your sacrifice will mean something," he had whispered at his father's grave before leaving for America. "I will build something that lasts." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. One of the regular customers at the laundromat was an elderly Italian woman named Mrs. Benedetto, who brought in her late husband's shirts every week, even though he had passed away 2 years earlier. Wei had noticed her routine, had seen the sadness in her eyes as she carefully folded the clean shirts and carried them home. One particularly cold February morning, as Mrs. Benedetto struggled with a heavy bag of laundry, Wei offered to help her carry it to her apartment 3 blocks away. She initially refused. She had been taught not to trust strangers, especially foreign ones, but the genuine kindness in his eyes eventually won her over. Mrs. Benedetto's apartment was a revelation. It was small and modest, but it had been furnished with exquisite taste and attention to detail. Every piece of furniture, every photograph, every decorative object told a story. The space felt warm and welcoming in a way that the grand hotels Wei studied could never achieve, despite their marble and gold. "My husband, he was in the hotel business," she explained as she made tea for both of them. "Not the fancy places downtown, but small family hotels in North Beach. He always said the secret wasn't in the thread count of the sheets or the size of the lobby. It was in making people feel like they were visiting family, not paying customers." She showed Wei photographs of the hotel her husband had managed for 30 years, a modest 3-story building with flower boxes in the windows and handwritten welcome notes for each guest. It looked nothing like the imposing structures Wei had been studying, but something about it spoke to him on a deeper level. He used to say that hospitality was about anticipating what people needed before they knew they needed it. Not the obvious things like clean towels and fresh coffee, but the deeper needs, the need to feel safe, to feel valued, to feel like they mattered to someone. That conversation changed everything for Wei. He realized he had been approaching his dream from the wrong angle, focusing on the external trappings of luxury rather than the internal experience of being truly welcomed. Mrs. Benedetto became more than just a customer. She became a mentor and eventually a dear friend. When Wei finally had enough money saved to make his move, she was the first person he told about his plans to purchase the rundown boarding house in the Mission District. "That's exactly what my husband would have done," she said with tears in her eyes. "He always believed that the best hotels were the ones that started with the biggest problems, because that's where you could make the biggest difference." After 2 years of saving every possible penny, sleeping 4 hours a night, and living on rice and vegetables from Chinatown's cheapest markets, Wei had accumulated $3,847. It wasn't enough to buy property in Union Square, but it was enough to purchase a rundown boarding house in the Mission District that everyone else had written off as worthless. The building was a disaster. Peeling paint, broken windows, plumbing that hadn't been updated since the 1920s, and a heating system that worked only when the wind blew from the east. The previous owner was eager to sell, convinced that the neighborhood would never improve, that the building would eventually be condemned. Wei saw something different. He saw potential. The first night he spent in the building, Wei barely slept. Not because of the broken heating system or the suspicious sounds coming from the walls, but because he was overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he had taken on. Every room needed work. Every system needed repair or replacement. Every surface needed attention. But as dawn broke and sunlight streamed through the grimy windows, Wei saw something else. Possibility. The building had good bones. The ceilings were high, the rooms were spacious, and the location, though currently undesirable, was actually quite convenient to downtown and the waterfront. For 6 months, he worked his 3 jobs during the day and renovated the boarding house at night. He taught himself plumbing from library books, learned electrical work from a friendly contractor named Giuseppe, who appreciated his determination, and painted every surface twice to cover decades of neglect. When he couldn't afford professional help, he bartered. English lessons for carpentry work, tax assistance for new fixtures, homemade meals for legal advice. Giuseppe, whose family had immigrated from Sicily 2 generations earlier, became Way's first real friend in America. Unlike the other contractors Way had approached, Giuseppe didn't see Way's foreign accent or limited resources as obstacles. Instead, he saw a kindred spirit, someone who understood what it meant to build something from nothing. "My grandfather, he came here with nothing but calloused hands and a strong back," Giuseppe told Way one evening as they replaced the building's ancient plumbing. "People looked down on him because he didn't speak the language perfect, because he didn't know the American ways. But he knew how to work, and he knew how to treat people right. That's what matters." Giuseppe introduced Way to other tradesmen in the Italian-American community, painters, electricians, tile workers, who were willing to work for reasonable rates in exchange for Way's promise to hire their services for future projects. It was an investment in relationships that would pay dividends for decades to come. The renovation process was exhausting, but it was also educational. Every evening spent learning a new skill, every problem solved through creativity rather than cash, every relationship built through mutual respect rather than financial leverage. All of it was preparation for the larger vision Way carried in his heart. Mrs. Benedetto visited the building regularly during the renovation, offering encouragement and practical advice based on her late husband's experience in the hospitality industry. She helped Way think through the layout of the common areas, suggested improvements that would make guests feel more at home, and even contributed some furniture and decorative items that had been stored in her apartment since her husband's hotel had closed. "A hotel is only as good as the stories it tells," she would say as they arranged furniture in what would become the main lounge. "Every chair, every painting, every flower arrangement should tell guests that they are valued, that their comfort matters, that someone has thought carefully about their experience." The boarding house reopened as the Mission Garden Inn 8 months later. It wasn't luxurious by any conventional standard, but it was clean, safe, and welcoming in a way that the grand hotels downtown had never quite mastered. We had installed small gardens in the courtyard, added reading nooks in the common areas, and created a kitchen where guests could prepare their own meals if they chose. Most importantly, he treated every guest, whether they were staying for a night or a month, with the same dignity and respect. The first guests were mostly other immigrants, a young family from Ireland who needed a place to stay while the husband looked for work, an elderly man from Japan who was visiting his grandchildren for the first time, a woman from Mexico who was in the city for medical treatment. We made it his practice to learn at least a few words in each guest's native language, to understand their reasons for traveling, and to help them navigate the challenges of being strangers in a new place. Word spread quickly through the city's immigrant communities. The Mission Garden Inn became known as the place where you could stay while looking for work, where you could receive mail while apartment hunting, where you could find someone who understood the challenges of starting over in a new country. We didn't just provide rooms, he provided hope. But We's true innovation was in the small details that made guests feel valued. He kept a notebook with information about each visitor, their preferences, their stories, their needs. When the Irish family returned 6 months later to show off their new baby, we had fresh flowers in their room and had arranged for a local bakery to deliver traditional Irish soda bread. When the elderly Japanese man came back the following Christmas, we had learned enough Japanese to greet him properly and had researched traditional Japanese New Year customs to make his stay more meaningful. These gestures didn't cost much money, but they required something more valuable: genuine attention and care. We understood that hospitality wasn't a transaction, it was a relationship. Within 3 years, the Mission Garden Inn was booked solid with a waiting list that stretched for months. We hired 2 employees. Maria, a woman from El Salvador who had been cleaning offices downtown and who had an innate understanding of what made spaces feel welcoming, and James, a young Black man who had been working construction but dreamed of hospitality management and who brought fresh ideas about customer service and operational efficiency. Both Maria and James became lifelong friends and eventually partial owners of the business. We believed that the people who helped build something should share in its success, a philosophy that would later become central to the culture of the entire Chen Hotels organization. The success of the Mission Garden Inn gave Wei the capital and credibility to pursue his real vision. In 1964, he purchased a small, failing hotel in downtown San Francisco's financial district. The building had good bones, but terrible management, and Wei saw an opportunity to create something unprecedented: luxury accommodations with the warmth and personal attention of a family business. The purchase negotiations were challenging. The previous owners were skeptical of Wei's ability to succeed, and several banks refused to provide financing for what they saw as a risky investment by an inexperienced foreigner. But Wei had built relationships throughout the city, and those relationships became his greatest asset. Giuseppe and his network of contractors vouched for Wei's work ethic and integrity. Mrs. Benedetto, who had connections throughout the Italian-American business community, made introductions to potential investors. Maria and James provided testimonials about Wei's management style and his commitment to treating employees fairly. Even some of the guests from the Mission Garden Inn wrote letters supporting Wei's loan application, describing how his attention to their needs had made their stays memorable. The financing finally came together through a combination of traditional bank loans, private investors from the Chinese-American community, and a partnership with an established hospitality company that was impressed by Wei's track record at the Mission Garden Inn. The renovation took 18 months, and every dollar Wei had saved, plus a loan from a Chinese-American bank that believed in his vision. He couldn't afford to hire a famous designer, so he designed it himself, combining Eastern and Western aesthetics in ways that felt both sophisticated and comfortable. Instead of marble and gold, he chose warm woods and natural stones. Instead of intimidating grandeur, he created spaces that felt like elegant homes. The design process was deeply personal for Wei. Every choice reflected his understanding of what travelers actually needed, not what the hospitality industry thought they wanted. The lobby was designed to feel like a living room where strangers might become friends, with comfortable seating areas and soft lighting that encouraged conversation. The guest rooms were designed to feel like bedrooms in a well-loved home, with quality linens, thoughtful amenities, and windows that actually opened to let in fresh air. Wei paid special attention to the staff areas, understanding that employees who felt valued and comfortable would provide better service to guests. The break rooms were spacious and well-lit, the uniform storage areas were organized and clean, and the employee entrance was dignified rather than hidden away like a shameful secret. The Grand Palace Hotel opened in 1966 to immediate acclaim. Travel magazines praised its innovative design and exceptional service. Business travelers appreciated the attention to detail and the staff's ability to anticipate needs without being intrusive. International visitors found it to be a perfect bridge between American efficiency and Eastern hospitality. But the real test came not from the critics or the travel writers, but from the guests themselves.
The Grand Palace quickly developed a reputation for the kind of service that couldn't be faked or manufactured, service that came from genuine care for the people who walked through its doors. Stories began circulating throughout the hospitality industry about the lengths to which Grand Palace staff would go to make guests feel valued. There was the time a guest mentioned in passing that he missed his mother's cooking, and the kitchen staff worked with him to recreate her recipe for chicken soup. There was the business traveler who had lost her presentation materials, and the concierge staff who worked through the night to help her reconstruct them. There was the elderly couple celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary, and the entire hotel staff who conspired to surprise them with a renewal ceremony in the lobby.
These weren't marketing stunts or publicity campaigns. They were the natural result of a culture that Wei had deliberately cultivated. A culture where every employee understood that their primary job was not to clean rooms or serve food or answer phones, but to make people feel cared for. Wei's true innovation was in how he treated his employees. Instead of the traditional hotel hierarchy that kept workers invisible and interchangeable, he created a system where every employee was encouraged to build relationships with guests, to take pride in their work, and to see themselves as partners in creating memorable experiences. He paid above-market wages, provided health insurance when it was still unusual, and created advancement opportunities for anyone willing to work hard and think creatively. Maria, who had started as a housekeeper at the Mission Garden Inn, became the head of housekeeping at the Grand Palace. James, who had begun as a front desk clerk, became the assistant general manager. Giuseppe, who had helped with the renovation, became the head of maintenance and eventually opened his own contracting company with Wei as his first major client. By 1970, the Grand Palace Hotel was booked solid year-round, with a reputation that attracted celebrities, diplomats, and business leaders from around the world. More importantly, it had inspired a new model of hospitality that other hotels began trying to emulate. The success brought offers to sell, to franchise, to expand rapidly across the country. But Wei was cautious. He had seen too many businesses lose their soul in the pursuit of growth. Instead of accepting the easy money, he chose to expand slowly and deliberately, always ensuring that each new property could maintain the standards and culture that had made the Grand Palace successful. Wei could have stopped there. He could have enjoyed his success, settled into the comfortable life of a single property owner, and watched his investment appreciate over time. Instead, he began expanding, always with the same careful attention to location, design, and service that had made the Grand Palace successful. The second property opened in Los Angeles in 1973, followed by locations in Seattle, Denver, and eventually New York. Each hotel was different, adapted to its local culture and clientele, but all shared the same commitment to hospitality that transcended mere luxury. The Los Angeles property was built in Beverly Hills, catering to the entertainment industry's need for discretion and luxury. Wei spent months studying the unique needs of actors, directors, and producers, learning about the pressures of celebrity and the desire for authentic experiences in a world of artificial glamour. The Seattle hotel was designed for business travelers and international visitors, with a focus on efficiency and comfort for people dealing with jet lag and complex schedules. Wei partnered with local businesses to offer unique amenities, partnerships with the Pike Place Market for fresh flowers and local delicacies, connections with outdoor gear companies for guests who wanted to explore the Pacific Northwest. Each expansion was an opportunity to refine and improve the Chen Hotel's philosophy. Wei learned from every mistake, celebrated every success, and constantly looked for ways to better serve the evolving needs of travelers. But perhaps most importantly, Wei never forgot the lessons he had learned during those early years of struggle. Even as his wealth grew and his influence expanded, he maintained the same humble approach to hospitality that had made the Mission Garden Inn successful. He still knew the names of his employees' children, still remembered the preferences of regular guests, still treated every interaction as an opportunity to make someone's day a little brighter. This was the legacy that my father, David Chen, inherited when Wei passed away in 1987. By then, Chen Hotels had grown to 12 properties across the western United States, with a reputation for innovation and service that had earned numerous industry awards. Dad's childhood had been spent observing his father's approach to business and life. Unlike many children of successful entrepreneurs, David had been required to work in the hotels from a young age, learning every aspect of the operation and understanding the values that made the company special. David's expansion of the business was more aggressive than his father's, but it was guided by the same principles. He opened properties in Hong Kong, Singapore, and eventually London and Paris, but he never sacrificed quality for quantity. Each new hotel was designed to reflect local culture while maintaining the Chen Hotel standard of genuine hospitality. The international expansion brought new challenges and opportunities. David had to learn to work with different cultural expectations, different regulatory environments, and different definitions of luxury and service. But he also discovered that the core principles his father had established, treating people with dignity, anticipating needs, creating genuine connections, were universal values that transcended cultural boundaries. The Hong Kong property, opened in 1982, became a landmark in the city's hospitality scene. David had spent 2 years studying the unique needs of business travelers working between East and West, and he designed a hotel that served as a cultural bridge. The staff was multilingual, the amenities catered to jet-lagged executives, and the design reflected both Chinese heritage and international sophistication. The Singapore Hotel, opened in 1985, focused on serving the growing technology and finance industries in Southeast Asia. David pioneered amenities that are now standard in business hotels: 24-hour business centers, high-speed internet connections, and meeting rooms designed for international video conferences. But David's proudest achievement was maintaining the family culture that his father had established, even as the company grew to employ thousands of people across multiple continents. He instituted programs to ensure that every employee, regardless of their position or location, understood the Chen Hotel's philosophy and felt empowered to create memorable experiences for guests. Dad expanded the business internationally, opening properties in Hong Kong, Singapore, and eventually London and Paris, but he never lost sight of his father's core philosophy, that hospitality is about making people feel valued, not just accommodated. I grew up in this world, but not in the way people might expect. My parents were determined that I understand the business from the ground up, that I never take for granted the sacrifices that had built our family's success. Starting at age 12, I spent my summers working in our hotels, not as the owner's daughter, but as a regular employee, earning minimum wage and learning every aspect of the operation. My first job was in housekeeping at our Seattle property. I spent 8 weeks learning to clean rooms to the Chen Hotel's standard, which was considerably higher than industry norms. I learned about thread counts and water pressure, about the importance of fresh flowers and the psychology of color in interior design. More importantly, I learned about the dignity of physical work and the satisfaction that comes from doing any job well. The following summer, I worked in the kitchen of our Los Angeles property, starting as a prep cook and gradually learning every station. The head chef, a woman named Catherine, who had worked for us for 15 years, treated me exactly like every other entry-level employee. I peeled vegetables, washed dishes, and learned to make the simple soups and salads that were the foundation of our room service menu. Catherine taught me that cooking for a hotel wasn't just about following recipes. It was about understanding that every meal was someone's experience of our hospitality. The businessman eating alone at midnight wasn't just ordering a sandwich. He was seeking comfort at the end of a difficult day. The family celebrating a birthday wasn't just ordering cake.
They were creating memories that would last a lifetime.
Each summer brought new challenges and learning opportunities. I worked the front desk, learning to check guests in and out, to handle complaints and special requests, to coordinate with other departments to ensure smooth operations. I worked in maintenance, learning about the complex systems that kept the hotels running behind the scenes. I worked in accounting, learning about budgets and profit margins and the financial discipline required to maintain quality while remaining profitable. But perhaps most importantly, I learned about people. I learned to read the subtle signs that indicated whether a guest was having a good experience or a bad one. I learned to anticipate needs before they were expressed. I learned that hospitality wasn't about providing a service, but about creating a feeling, the feeling of being welcomed, valued, and cared for. I cleaned rooms, worked in the kitchen, answered phones at the front desk, and eventually moved up to management positions in different properties. By the time I graduated from college with degrees in business administration and hospitality management, I had worked in every department of our hotels and understood the business from the perspective of both guests and employees. The college years were challenging in their own way. My classmates at Stanford came from wealthy families, but most of them had never worked a day in their lives. They saw my summer jobs as quaint or unusual, not understanding that I was receiving an education that couldn't be replicated in any classroom. My business professors were impressed by my practical knowledge, but some of my fellow students saw me as either privileged or eccentric. They couldn't understand why someone from a wealthy family would choose to spend summers cleaning toilets and washing dishes instead of interning at prestigious firms or traveling through Europe. But I understood what they didn't, that real leadership requires understanding every aspect of the operation, that authentic authority comes from having done the work yourself, and that you can't truly serve others if you don't understand what service actually requires. My hospitality management professors, many of whom had worked in the industry themselves, appreciated my hands-on experience. They used my summer work stories as case studies, helping other students understand the practical realities of hotel operations. But they also challenged me to think strategically about the future of the industry, to consider how changing technology and evolving customer expectations would affect traditional hospitality models. The decision to keep our family's ownership private wasn't about secrecy. It was about preserving the culture that made our hotels special. We didn't want to become another corporate chain where shareholders mattered more than guests or employees. We wanted to remain true to my grandfather's vision of hospitality that came from the heart, not from a manual. The pressure to go public had been building for years. Investment bankers regularly approached us with proposals for initial public offerings that would make our family incredibly wealthy on paper. But we had seen what happened to other family businesses that chose that path: the gradual erosion of values, the pressure to cut costs at the expense of quality, the transformation of employees from partners to expenses. My father and I made the decision together to remain privately held, to prioritize long-term value over short-term profits, and to continue treating our business as a family legacy rather than a financial instrument. This philosophy meant that while industry publications might feature our properties and business schools might study our management practices, the Chen family name remained largely unknown to the general public. Our guests knew they were staying at exceptional hotels, but most had no idea who owned them. We preferred it that way.
The anonymity gave us freedom to focus on what mattered most, creating exceptional experiences for guests and providing meaningful work for employees. We didn't have to worry about quarterly earnings reports or investor relations or the pressure to expand faster than our values could sustain. It also meant that I could travel and work without the burden of recognition. I could stay at our properties as a regular guest, observe operations without influencing them, and get honest feedback about our service and facilities. This anonymity was invaluable for understanding how our hotels actually functioned rather than how they appeared to function when the owner was present. Which brings me back to the marble hallway of the Grandview Palace Hotel, where I stood surrounded by my scattered belongings while a social media influencer named Brittany, I'd learned her name from her constant phone calls to various assistants, continued her tirade about my unsuitability for the 42nd floor. The Grandview Palace was our newest property, opened just 18 months earlier in the heart of Manhattan. It represented the culmination of everything our family had learned about hospitality over 6 decades, a perfect blend of luxury and warmth, sophistication and accessibility, tradition and innovation. The building itself was a masterpiece of adaptive reuse. We had purchased a historic office building that had been vacant for years and spent 3 years converting it into a hotel that honored its architectural heritage while incorporating every modern amenity and convenience. The 42nd floor, where this confrontation was taking place, housed our premium suites. Each one was individually designed and furnished, with original artwork, custom furniture, and views that showcased the best of the city. The presidential suite, where I had been staying, occupied the entire top floor and featured a private elevator, a full kitchen, and a terrace garden that few people knew existed. "This is the penthouse level," Brittany declared, as if I hadn't read the elevator buttons on my way up. "Do you have any idea how much I'm paying for this suite? $25,000 for the weekend. That's more than you probably make in 6 months." I bent down to retrieve a silk scarf that had fallen near her feet, careful not to touch her designer sneakers. The scarf had been my grandmother's, part of a collection she had assembled during her years of traveling with my grandfather as he built the business. Each piece had a story, a memory attached to it that made it more valuable than any designer accessory. "It's a beautiful hotel," I said conversationally, straightening up and folding the scarf carefully. "Have you stayed here before?" She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Obviously not, or I would have remembered you. Look, honey, I'm sure you're very nice, but there's clearly been some kind of mistake. This floor is for VIPs only. Maybe the front desk can find you something more appropriate on a lower floor." I continued gathering my belongings, noting how she emphasized the word appropriate, as if my presence here was somehow offensive. Her certainty was remarkable. She had looked at me for perhaps 30 seconds and made a complete assessment of my worth, my status, and my right to occupy the same space she occupied. It wasn't the first time I had encountered this kind of assumption. Over the years, I had been mistaken for a hotel employee, a travel writer, a personal assistant, and various other roles that people found more believable than hotel owner. My choice to dress simply and travel without an entourage had led to countless moments of being underestimated or dismissed.
Most of the time, I found these encounters amusing rather than offensive. They provided valuable insight into how our staff and guests were treated when they thought no one important was watching. They also served as regular reminders to stay humble and grounded, to never lose sight of the fact that worth isn't determined by appearance or possessions. But Brittany's behavior was different. There was a cruelty to her dismissal, a satisfaction she seemed to take in what she perceived as putting someone in their place. The way she had thrown my suitcase, the contempt in her voice, the absolute certainty that she had the right to decide who belonged where, all of it spoke to a deeper problem than simple misunderstanding. The elevator chimed, and I looked up to see Marcus Rodriguez step out, followed by 2 members of our security team. Marcus had been the general manager of the Grandview Palace for 8 years, ever since transferring from our Singapore property. He was one of the most competent hotel managers I'd ever worked with, and more importantly, he embodied the values my grandfather had instilled in our company culture. Marcus was in his mid-40s, the son of immigrants from Mexico who had worked their way up from entry-level positions in the hospitality industry. His parents had instilled in him the same work ethic and respect for others that my grandfather had valued in our company culture, and his rise through our organization had been based on merit, dedication, and an innate understanding of what genuine hospitality required.
I had first met Marcus when he was an assistant manager at our Los Angeles property, and I had been immediately impressed by his attention to detail and his ability to solve problems creatively. When the general manager position opened in Singapore, I had recommended him for the role despite his relative youth and lack of international experience. He had exceeded every expectation, helping to make our Singapore property one of the most successful in our portfolio. When we were preparing to open the Grandview Palace, Marcus was the obvious choice to lead the team. He had spent months recruiting and training staff, ensuring that every employee understood our philosophy and felt prepared to deliver the level of service our guests expected. "Miss Chen," Marcus said with a slight bow, his voice carrying the same warmth and respect it had held during our phone call. "I do apologize for this inconvenience. How can we resolve this situation?" The security team members, Thomas and Jennifer, both of whom I knew well, stood quietly behind Marcus, their presence commanding but not threatening. Thomas had been with us for 5 years, having transitioned from a career in law enforcement to hotel security. Jennifer was newer, a former military police officer who brought both professionalism and intuition to her work. Both of them had been trained in the Chen Hotel's approach to security, which emphasized de-escalation and service rather than intimidation and force. They were there to help resolve the situation, not to dominate it. Brittany's face went through a fascinating series of expressions as she processed what she was hearing. Confusion gave way to disbelief, then to a kind of desperate calculation as she tried to understand why the general manager was addressing me with such deference. I could see her mind working, trying to reconcile her assumptions about me with the evidence that was presenting itself. The general manager's respectful tone, the security team's professional demeanor, the careful way they were all treating what she had assumed was a case of mistaken identity. None of it fit the narrative she had constructed.
"Excuse me," she interrupted, stepping between Marcus and me with the kind of aggressive confidence that people often mistake for authority. "I'm the one who called for security. This woman is obviously in the wrong place, and I need her removed from my floor immediately." Marcus turned to her politely, his expression never changing from professional courtesy. He had dealt with countless difficult situations over his career, and he understood the importance of remaining calm and respectful, even when guests were behaving badly. "I'm sorry, but I believe there's been a misunderstanding," he said in the tone he reserved for particularly delicate situations. "May I see your room key, please?" Brittany fumbled in her designer handbag, producing a key card with obvious relief. This was her moment of vindication, her proof that she belonged here and I didn't. "Room 4237, the Platinum Penthouse Suite. As I told this woman, I'm paying $25,000 for the weekend, and I expect—" "Ma'am," Marcus interrupted gently. "Room 4237 is our executive suite, not the Platinum Penthouse, and our records show a rate of $8,000 for the weekend, not $25,000. The silence that followed was profound. I watched Brittany's face as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Her certainty crumbled, replaced by confusion, and the beginning of embarrassment. "That's impossible," she said, but her voice lacked the conviction it had carried moments before. "My assistant specifically booked the penthouse level. I'm an influencer with 3 million followers. I was promised the best suite in the hotel." Marcus nodded sympathetically, his demeanor remaining supportive even as he delivered information that was clearly devastating to Brittany's self-image. "The executive suite is indeed one of our finest accommodations, and we're honored to have you as our guest. However, the Platinum Penthouse Suite is room 4245, and it's currently occupied by Ms. Chen."
I watched Brittany's world collapse in real time. Her mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound, her face cycling through shades of pink and red as the implications of Marcus's words settled in. The designer's confidence that had carried her through the confrontation evaporated, leaving behind something much more fragile and desperate. But I'm staying in the penthouse," she stammered, holding up her key card as if it might somehow transform into proof of her claims. "My assistant said—" "The executive suite is a beautiful accommodation," Marcus said gently, his tone carrying no judgment despite the obvious lies Brittany had been telling. "The views are spectacular, and the amenities are quite comprehensive." I finished gathering my belongings, taking my time to fold each item carefully. The silk scarf went back into the suitcase first, followed by the cashmere sweater my mother had given me for my birthday, and the simple pearl necklace that had belonged to my great-grandmother. Each piece told a story of the women who had built this legacy alongside the men whose names appeared in the business records. "Thomas, Jennifer, would you mind helping me with my suitcase? I'm afraid the clasp was damaged in the excitement." Thomas stepped forward immediately, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he examined the vintage leather case. "The clasp can be repaired, Miss Chen. The leather's in excellent condition. They don't make them like this anymore. My grandfather bought it in Italy in 1968. He said quality luggage was an investment that would last generations. He was right about most things." Marcus had stepped aside to speak quietly with someone on his phone, and I could see him nodding as he received information. When he ended the call, his expression had shifted to something more serious.
"Ms. Chen," he said, approaching me with the careful demeanor of someone delivering delicate news, "I've just spoken with our guest services director. It appears there have been several incidents involving Miss Brittany's stay." Brittany's head snapped up at the mention of her name. "What kind of incidents? I haven't done anything wrong. I'm a paying guest and I have rights." "Ma'am," Marcus interrupted, his politeness now edged with steel. "According to our records, you've made 14 complaints to various staff members since checking in yesterday. Our housekeeping staff reports that you've been verbally aggressive regarding the thread count of the sheets, the temperature of the room, and the arrangement of the amenities." I raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. 14 complaints in less than 24 hours suggested someone who was either genuinely experiencing problems or who was creating problems to justify their sense of importance. "The concierge staff," Marcus continued, "has reported 3 separate incidents where you've demanded services that we don't provide and became hostile when they explained our policies. The restaurant staff has indicated that your behavior during dinner last night was disruptive to other guests." Each revelation seemed to physically diminish Brittany. Her shoulders dropped, her voice became smaller, and the aggressive posture she had maintained throughout our confrontation began to crumble. I wanted everything to be perfect," she said. And for the first time since I'd met her, she sounded genuinely vulnerable rather than artificially confident. "My followers expect a certain level of... they need to see that I belong in places like this." The admission hung in the air between us, revealing more about Brittany's motivations than hours of conversation might have accomplished. She wasn't staying here because she could easily afford it or because she genuinely appreciated luxury. She was staying here to create content, to maintain an image, to convince thousands of strangers that her life was more glamorous than it actually was. I understood that pressure, though from a different perspective. The weight of other people's expectations, the need to present a certain image, the fear that someone might see through the performance and discover that you're not quite who you pretend to be, these were feelings I recognized, even if my circumstances were vastly different from hers. "Ms. Brittany," I said, and my voice was gentler than it had been since our encounter began. "May I ask you something?" She nodded, looking suddenly much younger than the confident influencer who had thrown my suitcase into the hallway. "Are you actually enjoying your stay here? Not for the camera, not for your followers, but for yourself. Are you having a good time?" The question seemed to surprise her. She stood in the marble hallway, surrounded by luxury that she had been so desperate to claim as her own, and for the first time appeared to actually consider her experience, rather than simply performing it. I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been so worried about getting the right shots, making sure everything looks perfect for my posts, proving that I deserve to be here. I haven't really thought about whether I'm enjoying it." Marcus cleared his throat softly. "If I may," he said, addressing both of us, "perhaps we could move this conversation somewhere more comfortable. The presidential suite has a lovely sitting area, and I could arrange for some refreshments." I glanced at Brittany, noting the uncertainty in her eyes. She looked lost in a way that had nothing to do with hotel navigation, and everything to do with the more fundamental question of who she was when the cameras weren't rolling. "Would you like to join me for tea?" I asked her, surprising myself with the invitation. "The suite has a beautiful view of the city, and I think we might both benefit from starting this encounter over." Brittany's eyes widened with something that might have been hope. You would want to have tea with me? After what I did to your suitcase?" "Everyone deserves a second chance," I said, echoing something my grandfather used to tell difficult guests. "Besides, I'm curious about your story. What brought you to hospitality social media? It's not exactly a traditional career path." 20 minutes later, we were seated in the presidential suite's main living area, which occupied the eastern corner of the building and offered panoramic views of Manhattan. The late afternoon sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a warm light on the carefully curated furniture and artwork that made the space feel like an elegant home rather than a hotel room. Marcus had arranged for our kitchen staff to prepare a proper afternoon tea service: delicate sandwiches, fresh scones with clotted cream and jam, and an assortment of pastries that showcased the skills of our pastry chef. The tea itself was a custom blend that we served exclusively in our premium suites, created by a small tea company in London that specialized in unique combinations for luxury hotels. Brittany sat on the edge of an antique velvet chair, looking like she was afraid to fully relax. She had changed out of her designer athleisure into a simple black dress that was more flattering and less obviously expensive than her earlier outfit. Without the aggressive posturing, she appeared younger and more genuinely attractive. "This is beautiful," she said, gesturing toward the windows and the view beyond. "I've been trying to get the right lighting for photos all day, but I never just looked at it." I poured tea for both of us, using the ritual as a way to create a moment of calm in what had been a chaotic encounter. "Tell me about your work," I said. 3 million followers is impressive. How did you build that audience?" She wrapped her hands around the delicate china teacup as if it were a lifeline. "It started accidentally, actually. I was working at a marketing firm in Chicago, and I started posting pictures of the business trips I took. Hotels, restaurants, airports. I just thought my friends would find it interesting." The story that emerged over the next hour was familiar in many ways, yet unique in its details. Brittany had grown up in a middle-class family in Ohio, the daughter of a teacher and an accountant who had saved for years to afford family vacations. Her childhood travels had been modest, driving trips to national parks, occasional flights to visit relatives, but they had instilled in her a love of new places and experiences. "My parents worked so hard to give me opportunities they never had," she said, her voice softening as she talked about her family. "When I got the marketing job and started traveling for work, I felt like I was living their dream as much as my own." The social media following had grown organically at first. Her posts about business travel, tips for making the most of hotel amenities, reviews of airport lounges, photographs of interesting architecture and local cuisine had resonated with other young professionals who were navigating the world of business travel for the first time. But then brands started reaching out. Hotels wanted me to stay with them in exchange for posts. Airlines offered upgrades for reviews. Restaurant groups invited me to special events. Suddenly, what had been personal sharing became work.
I nodded, understanding the trajectory she was describing. Many industries have been transformed by social media influence, creating new categories of work that blend personal experience with commercial promotion. The hospitality industry, in particular, had embraced influencer marketing as a way to reach younger travelers and create buzz around new properties. "The problem," Brittany said, setting down her teacup with a soft clink, "is that the more followers you have, the more pressure there is to maintain a certain image. My audience expects luxury. They want to see me staying in penthouses, eating at Michelin-starred restaurants, and wearing designer clothes. If I show them reality, coach flights and chain hotels and budget meals, they get disappointed." "So you stretch beyond your means to create content that meets their expectations," I said, understanding the bind she had found herself in. "Exactly. I spend everything I earn, and more, trying to maintain the lifestyle that my followers think I live naturally. I book rooms I can't really afford, eat at restaurants that blow my budget, buy clothes I'll wear once for photos and then return." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "It's like being trapped in someone else's life." The admission explained so much about her behavior earlier. The exaggerated claims about room rates, the desperate need to establish her importance, the hostile reaction to what she perceived as a threat to her carefully constructed image. She hadn't been attacking me personally. She had been defending a fictional version of herself that required constant maintenance and protection. "That sounds exhausting," I said, and meant it. "When did you last take a vacation just for yourself? Not for content, not for your audience, but because you wanted to experience something new?" She was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the city spreading endlessly in all directions. "I honestly can't remember," she finally said. "Maybe 3 years ago? I went home to Ohio for Christmas and didn't post anything for a week. My follower engagement dropped, and I panicked. I spent the whole time worried about losing relevance instead of enjoying time with my family." The conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the suite's door. Marcus entered, carrying a small package wrapped in the hotel's signature paper. "Miss Chen, this arrived for you earlier. I thought you might want it now." I accepted the package, recognizing the return address immediately. It was from Mrs. Benedetto's daughter, Maria, who lived in San Francisco and occasionally sent items that had belonged to her mother, small mementos that connected our family's story to the people who had helped make it possible. "If you'll excuse me for a moment," I said to Brittany, carefully unwrapping the package. Inside was a small leather journal, its pages filled with Mrs. Benedetto's handwriting. A note from Maria explained that she had found it while cleaning out her apartment and thought I should have it. I opened the journal to a random page and smiled at what I found. It was a list of observations about hotel guests, written in Mrs. Benedetto's careful script. The businessman who orders the same meal every night is homesick, not boring. The woman who asks for extra towels is probably caring for someone who won't ask for help. The guest who complains about everything is usually complaining about things they can't control in their real life. "What is it?" Brittany asked, her curiosity apparently overcoming her earlier embarrassment. "A gift from the past," I said, showing her the journal. "This belonged to a woman who taught my grandfather about hospitality. She understood that the way people behave in hotels often has very little to do with the hotel itself." I read her the entry I had just discovered and watched as Brittany's face changed while she processed the implications.
The guest who complains about everything is usually complaining about things they can't control in their real life, she repeated slowly. Is that what I've been doing? Using the hotel staff as targets for frustrations that have nothing to do with them? "What do you think?" I asked, though her expression had already provided the answer. Brittany was quiet for several minutes, staring into her teacup as if it might contain solutions to problems she was only beginning to understand. When she looked up, her eyes were bright with tears she was trying not to shed. "I've been awful, haven't I? To the staff, to you, to probably everyone I've encountered since I arrived. I've been so focused on protecting this image that I forgot how to be a decent person." "You're being a decent person right now," I pointed out. "Self-awareness is the first step toward change." She laughed, and this time there was genuine humor in it, albeit mixed with embarrassment. "My grandmother would be mortified if she knew how I'd been behaving. She raised me to treat service workers with respect, to say please and thank you, to remember that everyone is someone's child." "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." She was. She worked as a hotel housekeeper for 30 years, saved every penny to help pay for my college education. She would have loved this place, not because it's expensive, but because you can tell that people care about the details. Brittany gestured around the suite, taking in the fresh flowers, the carefully arranged books, the way the afternoon light had been considered in the placement of the furniture. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Here was a woman whose grandmother had worked in hotels, who had been raised to respect the people who made hospitality possible, and yet she had spent the last day treating hotel staff poorly in service of an image that would have disappointed the person who had shaped her values. "What would your grandmother tell you to do now?" Brittany didn't hesitate. "Apologize. To everyone. Make it right, even if it's embarrassing." She paused, then looked directly at me. "Starting with you. I'm so sorry about your suitcase, about the things I said, about assuming anything at all. You've been incredibly kind to someone who didn't deserve it." "Apology accepted," I said simply, "but I'm not the only person who deserves one." "No, you're not." She stood up, suddenly decisive. "Would it be possible to speak with the staff members I was rude to? I know it won't undo what I said, but I want them to know that I recognize my behavior was unacceptable." I smiled, seeing in her request the influence of the grandmother who had raised her with better values than she had been displaying. "I think that can be arranged." What followed was perhaps the most unusual afternoon I had ever spent at one of our properties. Brittany, with Marcus's assistance, tracked down every staff member she had interacted with since her arrival. She apologized to the housekeeping supervisor for her complaints about the sheets, explaining that her frustration had nothing to do with the quality of service. She found the concierge who had patiently explained why we couldn't arrange certain services, and thanked him for his professionalism in the face of her unreasonable demands. Most memorably, she visited the restaurant where she had apparently been difficult during dinner the previous evening. The maitre d', a dignified man named Philippe, who had worked in fine dining for over 20 years, listened to her apology with the kind of grace that comes from experience with all types of guests. "Mademoiselle, it takes courage to return and make things right. This gesture honors not just us, but yourself." By early evening, Brittany had completed her rounds of apologies. We reconvened in the presidential suite,
where she looked emotionally drained but somehow lighter than she had appeared since I'd met her. "How do you feel?" I asked, settling back into my chair with a fresh cup of tea. "Embarrassed, but clean, somehow. Like I've been carrying around this weight I didn't realize was there." She shook her head. "I can't believe I let myself become someone who treats people badly. That's not who I was raised to be." "People lose themselves sometimes," I said, thinking of my own moments of doubt and poor judgment over the years. "The important thing is finding your way back." Brittany was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Can I ask you something personal?" I nodded. "Who are you? Really? I mean, I know you're Ms. Chen, and clearly you're important to this hotel, but there's more to the story, isn't there?" I considered how to answer. The events of the day had created an unusual intimacy between us, two strangers who had moved from conflict to understanding in the space of a few hours. She had been honest about her struggles and insecurities. Perhaps it was time for me to share something of my own story. My grandfather built the first hotel in our family with $17, and a dream that most people thought was impossible. I began and found myself telling her about Wei's journey from dishwasher to hotel owner, about the values he had instilled in the business, about the philosophy that had guided our family's approach to hospitality for 3 generations. Brittany listened intently, asking thoughtful questions and making connections between my family story and her own experiences with travel and hospitality. As the sun set over Manhattan and the city lights began to twinkle on the darkening sky, I realized that what had started as a confrontation had become something much more valuable, a genuine conversation between two people who had each learned something important about themselves. "So, this whole place, this whole chain, it's your family's business?" she asked as my story wound down. "It is. And what happened today, the way you were treated by our staff, even when you were being difficult, that's not an accident. It's the result of decades of building a culture that values every person who walks through our doors. Even people like me, who don't deserve it? Especially people like you. Everyone comes to a hotel carrying their own struggles, their own pressures, their own fears. Our job isn't to judge. It's to provide a place where people can rest, recharge, and hopefully remember what it feels like to be cared for." Brittany was quiet for a long time, staring out at the city lights. When she spoke again, her voice was thoughtful rather than emotional. "I think I've forgotten what it feels like to be genuinely cared for. I've been so focused on performing care, showing my followers beautiful meals and luxury accommodations, that I stopped experiencing it myself." "That's not uncommon," I said. "We see it often in our business. People who are so busy documenting their experiences that they forget to actually have them." "What should I do?" she asked, and there was a vulnerability in the question that reminded me how young she really was. "About my career, I mean. About the followers who expect me to live this lifestyle I can't actually afford." It was a question that went far beyond hospitality, touching on issues of authenticity, financial responsibility, and personal fulfillment that millions of young people were grappling with in the age of social media. What would make you happy? Not what would get you more followers or more brand partnerships, but what would actually bring you joy. She considered this seriously. "I used to love writing," she said eventually. "Before the social media thing took off, I wrote travel articles for small magazines. They didn't pay much, but I enjoyed researching destinations, interviewing local people, finding stories that other travel writers missed." "What stopped you from continuing that work?" "It didn't scale," she said with a rueful laugh. "Writing an in-depth article about a small town in Vermont might reach a few thousand readers. Posting a single photo from a luxury resort can reach millions. The math seemed obvious. But the math doesn't account for satisfaction, does it? No, it doesn't. She paused, then looked at me with sudden intensity. Would you mind if I asked you about something? A different kind of story? I gestured for her to continue. This conversation we've had, this whole day, it's given me an idea for a different kind of content. Not about luxury or lifestyle aspirations, but about authenticity, I guess. About the stories behind the places we visit, the people who make hospitality possible, the difference between experiencing something and just photographing it. I could see where she was going with this, and I found myself intrigued by the possibility. I know I don't have the right to ask for anything after how I behaved, but would you be willing to let me tell this story? Not in a way that violates your privacy or exploits your family's business, but in a way that might help other people understand what genuine hospitality looks like. It was an unexpected request, but not an unwelcome one. Over the years, our family had been approached by numerous journalists and writers interested in our story, but most had been focused on the business success rather than the values that had made that success possible. Brittany's proposal was different. She was offering to explore the human elements of hospitality, the relationships and philosophies that transformed a simple transaction into something more meaningful. What would that look like? I asked. I'm not entirely sure yet, she admitted. Maybe a series of posts about the real people who make hotels work. Not just management, but housekeeping staff, maintenance workers, kitchen employees. Maybe stories about guests who have been touched by exceptional service, or about family businesses that prioritize values over profits. The idea had merit. In an industry often criticized for prioritizing shareholder returns over employee welfare, showcasing companies that operated differently could be valuable. And Brittany's insider knowledge of social media, combined with her apparent genuine interest in storytelling, could make her an effective advocate for a different approach to hospitality. There would be conditions, I said. No exploitation of our employees for content, no revealing information that could compromise guests' privacy, and nothing that presents our business as perfect. We make mistakes, and any honest portrayal would acknowledge that. Of course, she said quickly. I wouldn't want to create propaganda. The goal would be authentic storytelling, not marketing material. We spent the next hour discussing the practicalities of such a project. Brittany would need to fundamentally restructure her social media approach, potentially alienating followers who were primarily interested in luxury lifestyle content. She would need to develop new skills in interviewing and long-form storytelling. Most challenging of all, she would need to find a way to make this more authentic content financially sustainable. It might mean starting over, I warned her, building a different kind of audience. Probably smaller initially. Are you prepared for that? I think I have to be, she said. This conversation has made me realize that I've been living someone else's life, trying to be someone else's version of successful. Maybe it's time to figure out who I actually am and what I actually want to contribute. As our evening together drew to a close, I found myself reflecting on the unexpected turns that life can take. This morning, I had planned a quiet weekend in New York, catching up on reading and perhaps visiting a few museums. Instead, I had spent the day in deep conversation with the stranger who had taught me as much about authenticity and courage as I had hopefully taught her about hospitality and grace. Brittany packed her belongings that evening, not because she was being asked to leave, but because she had decided to change her travel plans. Instead of staying through the weekend to create luxury lifestyle content, she was flying back to Ohio to visit her family and think seriously about the direction of her career. I haven't been home in 8 months, she told me as she prepared to leave. I kept making excuses about being too busy, but the truth is I was afraid they would see through the image I've been projecting and realize that I'm not as successful as I pretend to be.
Families usually see through those things anyway, I said. They love us despite our pretenses, not because of them. At the door of the presidential suite, she paused and turned back to me. "Thank you," she said simply, "for the second chance, for the conversation, for treating me like a person worth listening to, even after I behaved so badly." "Everyone deserves the chance to be their better self," I replied. "You just needed a reminder of who that person was." After she left, I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the presidential suite, looking out at the city that never sleeps. The light stretching to the horizon reminded me of all the stories unfolding simultaneously. Millions of people pursuing their dreams, struggling with their challenges, searching for connection and meaning in their daily lives. I thought about my grandfather, Wei, and how he would have handled the situation with Brittany. He probably would have invited her for tea much sooner than I had, would have seen past her defensive behavior to the insecurity and loneliness that motivated it. He had always been better than I was at recognizing when someone's poor behavior was actually a cry for help. But he also would have been proud, I thought, of how the day had unfolded. The staff had maintained their professionalism and kindness, even when faced with a difficult guest. A moment of conflict had been transformed into an opportunity for understanding. And perhaps most importantly, someone who had lost sight of their values had found their way back to them. The next morning, I received a text from Brittany. She had made it home safely and had spent the evening talking with her parents about her work and her life. The message included a photo of her grandmother's Bible, open to a passage about treating strangers with kindness because you never know when you might be entertaining angels. "Thank you for being my angel yesterday," the message read. "I have a lot of work to do on myself, but for the first time in years, I'm excited about the person I might become." I smiled, saving the message before setting my phone aside. Outside, Manhattan was coming to life for another day. Millions of people beginning their personal journeys toward connection, understanding, and grace. In a few hours, I would check out of the presidential suite and return to my regular life. But I would carry with me the reminder that every encounter is an opportunity to practice the values my grandfather had instilled in our family business. That every person has worth, every moment of kindness matters, and the most profound luxury we can offer anyone is the simple gift of being truly seen and valued. The woman who had thrown my suitcase into the hallway was not the same person who had hugged me goodbye the night before. That transformation, from defensive cruelty to vulnerable authenticity, was perhaps the most beautiful thing I had witnessed in years of observing human nature through the lens of hospitality. And in helping her find her way back to herself, I had been reminded of something equally important, that the values my grandfather had built into our business weren't just about running successful hotels. They were about creating spaces where people could discover and rediscover their better selves, one genuine interaction at a time. The story would continue, as all good stories do. Brittany would face the challenge of rebuilding her career on a foundation of authenticity rather than aspiration. I would return to the work of preserving and evolving a family legacy in an industry that often prioritized profit over people. The hotel staff would continue their daily practice of transforming stranger encounters into moments of human connection. But for one perfect weekend in Manhattan, in the marble hallways of the Grandview Palace Hotel, two strangers had discovered that beneath our constructed identities and defensive behaviors, we all share the same fundamental needs: to be understood, to be valued, and to know that our better selves are worth the effort it takes to find them.